The termination letter had already been signed when Callum Reid walked out of the Meridian construction tower for the last time, carrying a canvas tote bag and the small yellow raincoat his 9-year-old son had left in the break room. 2 Fridays ago, during one of those desperate bring-your-kid-to-work days that nobody officially approved, but everyone quietly allowed. Behind him, the project managers assumed he had finally cracked under pressure. A few of them said so out loud in the elevator. Others just nodded, the way people nod when something confirms what they already believed. None of them knew that Callum had not cracked at all. He had simply done the math. The kind of math no spreadsheet captures, and realized the numbers no longer added up in any direction that mattered. None of them knew about the phone call he had received at 11:47, the previous Thursday night, when his son Jonah's school called to say the boy had been found sitting alone on the front steps at 4:30 in the afternoon, 2.5 hours after dismissal, still waiting, still believing his father would come. Callum stood in the parking garage for a long moment before getting into his truck. The yellow raincoat was still damp from last week's rain. He set it on the passenger seat, where his wife Nora used to sit, and drove home. He had spent 14 years building other people's structures, bridges, towers, drainage systems under entire city blocks. The kind of infrastructure that holds a place together without anyone ever thinking about it. He was the person you called when the numbers stopped working. And the deadline had already passed. At Meridian, they called him quietly, in hallways, the way people summon someone they need, but would rather not publicly acknowledge needing. Nora died 22 months before he resigned. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in September, gone by February. The timeline was brutal in its efficiency. She was 41 years old, and had been planning to go back to school in the spring. After she died, Callum did what a lot of men in his position do. He worked harder. He told himself it was for Jonah, for the mortgage, for the benefits package that covered Jonah's twice-weekly therapy sessions. And some of that was true. But some of it was also because coming home to the apartment at 6:30 meant coming home to a silence so complete. It had a physical weight, and the office, at least, had noise. He asked his supervisor twice in the first year for modified hours, earlier start, earlier finish. So he could be the one to pick Jonah up, instead of relying on the rotating patchwork of neighbors and after-schools programs that were costing him $800 a month and still left gaps. Both times he was told the project timeline didn't allow for it. The third time he asked, his supervisor looked at him with an expression that was almost kind, and said, "Callum, everyone here has obligations outside the office. That's just the reality of this level." The word everyone did a lot of work in that sentence. Callum didn't push back. He just nodded, and went back to his desk, and redesigned a load-bearing wall configuration that saved the company $400,000 in materials, which he found out later when he overheard it mentioned at a quarterly meeting, where his name was not said once. The day Jonah was found waiting on the school steps, Callum had been in an emergency site meeting that ran 3 hours over because the project director, a man named Jeffrey Crane, who had never held a transit level in his life, kept changing his mind about the north facade. Callum had texted the after-school program coordinator 4 times. The messages showed as delivered. Nobody called him until nearly midnight. He sat on the edge of Jonah's bed that night, long after the boy had fallen asleep, listening to him breathe, and thought about the word his supervisor had used 2 years ago, replaceable. He had been turning it over in his mind ever since, like a stone you can't stop picking up. And sitting there in the dark, he finally understood something. The company would replace him in 6 weeks. Jonah could not replace him at all. He handed in his resignation the next morning before the first meeting started. The person who received it, technically, it went to HR, but it landed on the desk of the company's CEO within the hour, was a woman named Sylviane Bouchard. She had run Meridian Construction for 7 years. Before that, she had spent a decade in infrastructure finance in Montreal, which meant she understood numbers the way surgeons understand bodies. Functionally, precisely, without sentiment. She had turned a struggling mid-sized firm into one of the largest construction companies in Ontario, by making fast decisions and not apologizing for them. When her assistant flagged Callum's resignation, Sylviane read the name, paused for 3 seconds, and then asked whether the Whitmore Bridge tender had been filed yet. It had not. Callum was the only person at Meridian who fully understood the geotechnical complexity of the project. She asked HR to reach out. HR sent an email. Callum did not reply. For the first week, Sylviane assumed someone else on the team would step in. Engineers were engineers, systems were systems. But by the second week, it became clear that the knowledge Callum carried, the specific, accumulated, irreplaceable kind, that doesn't live in any file or manual, had walked out the door with him. A junior engineer spent 9 hours trying to recreate one of his foundation assessments, and got it wrong in a way that wouldn't have been immediately obvious to anyone who hadn't worked the site. Sylviane caught it herself at midnight, sitting alone in her office, with a coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. She did not reach out through HR again. She drove to his address herself. She almost didn't recognize it as a residential building at first. It was a low-rise on the east side of the city, the kind of building that had been functional in 1987, and had been quietly aging ever since. The lobby intercom had 2 buttons that didn't work. There was a grocery bag wedged in the stairwell door, to keep it from latching. Sylviane had grown up in a building not entirely unlike this one, in Laval, which is perhaps why she didn't look away. She just noted it, the way she noted everything, and found the right unit. Callum answered the door in a flannel shirt, holding a pot with a dish towel looped over his wrist. Behind him, Jonah was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, or trying to. He had a pencil in his hand and a look on his face that suggested he was mostly thinking about something else. The apartment was small and visibly lived in. There were hockey cards spread across the coffee table. A child's winter jacket hung from the back of a chair, because the coat hook near the door had been pulled from the drywall, and not yet re-insured. 2 framed photos of a woman with dark eyes sat on the bookshelf, and Sylviane noticed that both of them faced slightly outward, the way you position something you want to be able to see from more than one angle in the room. Callum looked at her without particular surprise. He stepped aside and asked if she wanted to come in. She explained the situation, the Whitmore tender, the timeline, the technical gap his absence had created. She spoke the way she always spoke, directly, without padding. She told him she needed him back on the project. He listened. He set the pot down on the counter. He said no. Sylviane Bouchard had not heard that word very often in the last 7 years. She was not entirely sure how to respond to it. She said she could offer him an increased rate for the duration of the project. He said that wasn't the issue. She asked what the issue was. He was quiet for a moment, and then he looked over at Jonah, who had stopped pretending to do homework, and was now watching the conversation with the frank attention of a child, who understands more than adults expect. Callum's said. I was picking him up at 3:15 every day for 2 weeks before this job started. That's the first time I've done that since his mother died. I'm not giving that back. Sylviane had no answer to that. She left her card on the counter and let herself out. She drove home on the 401 thinking about the 2 photographs on the bookshelf. She thought about the coat hook that hadn't been fixed yet. She thought about a 9-year-old boy who had been waiting on school steps at 4:30 in the afternoon with his backpack between his feet. And she thought about what that afternoon must have looked like to him. She lived in a condo on the 31st floor of a building in the financial district. When she got home, she stood at the window with the city spread out below her and noticed, for the first time in a long time, how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. She had never been married. She had been engaged, once, briefly, at 33, and had ended it herself, because the timing wasn't right, and the work was demanding, and she had believed, at the time, that those were good reasons. She had not thought about it very much since then. Standing at the window that night, she thought about it now. She thought about Callum's face when he looked at his son. Meanwhile, Callum spent the first month rebuilding a different kind of structure. He took on 2 private consulting contracts, small stuff, residential mostly, the kind of work he could schedule around Jonah's day. He was home by 3. He made dinner before 6. He helped with homework at the kitchen table, while Jonah complained that fractions were invented specifically to ruin his life, and Callum told him, with complete seriousness, that he agreed, and that he would still be expected to learn them. On weekends, they went to the rink at Victoria Park. Jonah was not a natural skater, which he had inherited from Callum rather than Nora, who had grown up in Sudbury and moved on ice like it was a second language she'd learned before the first. They fell down together, mostly. They laughed more than they had in almost 2 years. Callum bought hot chocolate from the concession stand, and let Jonah put in 4 packets of sugar, which he would not have done before. But the financial reality of those weeks was quietly brutal. The consulting contracts paid but not consistently. A property tax bill arrived that he had been deferring. Jonah needed new skates and winter boots in the same month, which they do not sell in combinations anywhere. Callum sold his good transit level, a Leica, bought used but maintained carefully for 11 years, to cover the gap. He told Jonah it was just equipment he no longer needed. He said it the same way he said a lot of things, in the tone of a man who has decided that the true accounting of a situation is private. Sylviane saw him 3 weeks later, entirely by accident. She was in the East End for a site visit that had run long, and she stopped at a hardware supply shop on Danforth to pick up something her building superintendent had requested. Callum was there, talking to the owner about a drainage problem in a client's basement. He was sketching something on the back of a receipt. A cross-section, she could see, with measurements notated in a handwriting she recognized from 14 years of his project files. She watched him for a moment, from between 2 shelving units. He was laughing at something the owner had said. He looked less tired than he had at the office. He looked like a different version of the same person, or maybe the same version of a person she had never actually looked at. She almost left without saying anything. She didn't. He turned around and saw her, and there was a brief pause that neither of them tried to fill with anything. Then Jonah appeared from the next aisle carrying a box of screws he had been asked to hold, and looked at Sylviane with the direct, evaluating stare of a 9-year-old, who has learned to assess adults quickly. "Do you work with my dad?" Jonah asked. "I used to," Sylviane said. Jonah considered this. "He's better at this stuff than he was at that job," he said, with the casual certainty of someone reporting weather. Then he handed the screws to his father and went back to examining a display of utility knives with scientific interest. Callum looked at her. Something passed across his face that was not quite a smile. She asked if she could buy them both a coffee. He said Jonah didn't drink coffee. She said she had seen a place across the street, with what appeared to be an unreasonable number of baked goods in the window. Jonah, who had apparently excellent peripheral hearing, said he would like to examine the baked goods. They sat at a small table near the window, while Jonah worked through a cinnamon roll the size of his face. Sylviane asked Callum how the consulting work was going. He told her honestly, it was fine, but inconsistent. She did not try to use this as an opening. She asked him something else instead. What he had liked about the work, before everything. Not the company, the actual work. He talked for 20 minutes. She had never heard him talk for 20 minutes about anything. He talked about load paths and how they're like arguments. They have to follow logic from premise to conclusion, or the whole thing fails eventually. He talked about the particular satisfaction of solving a problem that someone else has declared unsolvable, which he insisted was less about ego than about the problem itself, which has a kind of dignity that deserves respect. He talked about a footbridge he had helped design in his second year out of school, in a small town in northern Ontario, that he had driven back to see 5 years later just to watch people walk across it. Sylviane listened. She was good at listening in meetings, in the transactional sense. This was different. She found herself paying attention in a way that felt unfamiliar, and slightly inconvenient. Jonah fell asleep on the drive home, in the back seat of her car, because Callum's truck was in the shop, and she had offered to drive them, which she told herself was simply efficient. She watched in the rearview mirror as the boy's head tipped sideways against the window, and his breathing slowed, and she thought about what it meant to be responsible for another person's sleep. To be the reason someone felt safe enough to let their eyes close. She had built a company. She had never built that. Over the weeks that followed, she found reasons to be in the East End more often than strictly necessary. She told herself it was about the Whitmore project, and sometimes it was. She drove by the hardware store once without stopping, and felt faintly ridiculous about it, which was itself an unfamiliar sensation. She was not a person who felt faintly ridiculous. She was a person who made decisions and implemented them. But some things do not respond well to implementation. One Saturday afternoon in early December, Callum called her. Not about the project. He had been thinking about something she'd said, during one of their conversations about the Whitmore site. A comment she'd made about foundation settlement patterns in clay-heavy soil. And he had a different reading of the data that he thought she should consider. She said she would look at it. They talked for 40 minutes. When they finally hung up, she sat in her kitchen for a while without doing anything, which was not something she normally did. Jonah had started leaving her a drawing on the rare occasions when she came to the apartment. Small crayon pictures left on the kitchen counter, always of the same subject. A bridge, rendered with 9-year-old accuracy, which is to say the proportions were creative, but the intent was clear. He always put 2 people on the bridge. He never explained why. She kept every one of them. They were in a folder on her desk, under a stack of quarterly reports where nobody would look. The Whitmore situation was deteriorating. The board had brought in an external consultant, at significant expense, and the consultant had produced a report that was technically coherent, but missed the specific site conditions that Callum had spent a year documenting. The tender deadline was 8 weeks out. Sylviane knew what she needed to do. What she hadn't yet worked out was whether she could ask it of him in a way that was honest, which meant acknowledging not just what she needed from him professionally, but what the company had failed to give him for a very long time. She spent a week on it. She went through Callum's personnel file, which she had never read beyond the basics. She read 14 years of performance reviews, most of them uniformly excellent, and noticed that the recommendations for advancement had been filed, reviewed, and quietly set aside 3 times in the last 5 years in favor of candidates with louder profiles and less precision. She read the 2 formal requests he had made for modified hours after his wife died, and the responses from his direct supervisor, which were polite and useless. She read the incident report from the after-school program about the Thursday in October, when a child had waited 2.5 hours on the front steps of a school on Mortimer Avenue. She did not sleep well that week. On a Friday evening in mid-December, when the city outside was doing what Canadian cities do in December, dark by 4:30, cold in the specific way that gets into the joints, she drove to Callum's building. She had not called ahead. She stood in the lobby with the broken intercom buttons, and found the right unit number and went upstairs, and she stood in the hallway outside his door for longer than she would have admitted to anyone, holding a folder under her arm. The folder did not contain a contract. Callum answered. Jonah was visible in the background, sprawled on the couch with a book, in a posture that suggested reading, had recently lost to television, but was making a determined comeback. The apartment smelled like something with garlic. The coat hook had been fixed. Callum looked at her for a moment. He didn't say anything. She said she had come to tell him something, not to ask him something. There was a difference, and she wanted him to know. She understood that difference. She told him that she had read his file. She said she understood, now, what the company had done, or more precisely, what it had failed to do. And she was not going to dress that up in the language of business needs or exceptional circumstances. Because it hadn't been exceptional. It had been consistent, and consistent failures are choices, even when nobody uses that word. She said she was sorry. She said it plainly, without hedging, which was the only way she knew how to say things. She told him she had made 3 changes to Meridian's HR structure in the past month. A formal flexible work policy for caregivers, an anonymous reporting channel for compensation concerns, and a requirement that any performance recommendation left unacted for more than 60 days require a written explanation to the board. She told him she had also reviewed the compensation history for the Whitmore project, and identified the amounts that should have been attributed to his contributions, and that a corrected figure had been processed. Callum had not moved. She opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, which cost her more than the board meeting where she'd announced restructuring. Because she'd written it 4 times before she got it right. It said that if he returned, he would have full authority over the structural engineering division, with hours structured around his son's school schedule. It said that Meridian would fund Jonah's extracurriculars for as long as Callum worked there, and cover the cost of the therapy sessions that the previous benefits package had capped at 12 per year. Which was not enough, and she had known it wasn't enough when she'd approved the policy and had not changed it, and that was on her. It said that no one who worked under her leadership would again be asked to choose between doing their job and being present for their child. And that she would make that commitment publicly. At the bottom, in smaller writing, she had added something that was not about the job. It said, "I have been building the wrong things for a long time. I think you know what it looks like to build the right ones. I would like to learn that, if you'll let me." Callum read it twice. The apartment was quiet except for Jonah turning a page, and the city outside doing its winter thing, and the small sound of a father standing in his own kitchen, trying to decide what to trust. He looked up. "You wrote this yourself," he said. It wasn't a question. 4 times, she said. From the couch, without looking up from his book, Jonah said, "Dad, it's getting cold in here." Callum looked at his son for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. She came in. The coat hook held. What happened after that was quieter than the story that preceded it, which is usually how the important things go. Callum returned to Meridian in January, with the title of Director of Structural Engineering, and a schedule that meant he was at the school gate every afternoon, at 3:15, rain or cold, or the particular gray slush that Toronto produces from February through April, as a test of character. The Whitmore Bridge tender was filed on time. It was awarded in March. The structural solution at its core had been designed by a man eating a grocery store sandwich at a kitchen table, while his son did fractions in the background, and it will stand for 120 years, which is longer than anyone in the meeting room where it was approved will be alive to see. Sylviane restructured the company in ways that made 2 board members uncomfortable, and 1 very good project manager cry, in the good way, in the parking garage, alone, which she later told Callum about. She started leaving the office before 7. This was noticed, it was not discussed. She and Callum were not easy with each other, not at first. They were 2 people who had each learned to hold things closed, and habits like that don't open on a schedule. But Jonah had no such complications. He decided early that Sylviane was a permanent feature of the landscape, the way children decide things, completely, and without consulting anyone. He left her a drawing every time she came over, always the bridge, always 2 figures, until one day, there were 3. He gave it to her without comment, the way you give someone something you already know they'll keep. She keeps it on her desk now, on top of the quarterly reports. At the Whitmore Bridge opening in October, the city gathered on a gray Tuesday morning with the lake behind them, and the wind doing what lake wind does. There were speeches. Callum stood near the back with Jonah beside him, their collars up, watching the first transit car cross the span. The structure behaved exactly as the calculations said it would. Of course it did. Sylviane found them afterward, near the railing, looking out over the water. She stood beside Callum, and did not say anything for a while. Jonah was leaning over the railing in the way that makes every parent's heart do a small complicated thing, watching the water move below. "Did you help build this one?" Jonah asked her. She thought about it. "A little," she said. "Your dad built it." Jonah nodded, satisfied with this, the way he was satisfied with things that were simply true. The wind came off the lake, the bridge held. There's a statistic worth knowing. In Canada, approximately 1 in 5 single parents raising children under 12 reports missing a significant family event in the past month because of workplace inflexibility. That's not a footnote. That's a child on a set of front steps at 4:30 in the afternoon, waiting for someone who is stuck in a meeting that doesn't know he exists. This is a story about one of them. If it reminded you of someone, if it reminded you of yourself, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that the most important structures we build are the ones people can actually live inside, subscribe to Resilience Tales. There are more of these stories, there always are.